So I would probably say that the Book of Mormon is very likely one of the most heavily criticized pieces of literature that we've ever had in circulation. And these criticisms of the Book of Mormon go all the way back to before the Book of Mormon was even published. From the moment that Joseph Smith claimed that he had access to an ancient record and that God needed him to translate that record, people have been theorizing about its origins. They've been criticizing Joseph Smith, questioning his motivations and his inspirations. And then, of course, once the Book of Mormon was published, people had access to the text. It has been torn apart and analyzed, and all sorts of theories and controversies surrounding the book itself have surfaced. Now, the problem that you're going to run into is that if you want to see and you want to learn what some of these criticisms are and what some of the controversy surrounding the text is, you have almost 200 years worth of material that you need to sift through. Because these criticisms have been being published and republished and passed around and analyzed and discussed for nearly 200 years. So here's what I want to do. I want to help you narrow down your search just a little bit by recommending an absolutely fantastic book. And this book is titled Studies of the Book of Mormon by B.H. Roberts. Now, I want to recommend this book for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because it presents some absolutely fantastic criticisms of the Book of Mormon. Second, because of the controversy surrounding the contents of the book and the history of how we got this book in the first place. Third, because of the author, B.H. Roberts. This book is one of the most unique approaches to criticisms of the Book of Mormon that you are ever going to get. Now, if we really want to understand the significance of this book and the significance of the studies presented in this book, we need to understand who exactly Brigham Henry Roberts was. It's important to note that he was a member of the Quorum of the 70. He was a historian of the church, and he was a master theologian. He had independently written a 6-volume comprehensive history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was an incredibly well-known author. He had written defenses on the faith. He had written defenses on the Book of Mormon. And he was even at one point an editor for church magazines. Beyond that, he was also incredibly respected within leadership of the church. His position as an author and as a historian, and as I said, a master theologian, he actually wrote the curriculum for the quorum meetings of the Quorum of the 70. He planned out what was taught to members of the 70 and made sure that they had a firm understanding of theology. So this was an incredibly well-respected man. And as a matter of fact, you can still find books that he had written on bookshelves today, despite the fact that he died in 1933, including, of course, the book that we're talking about. Now, this work is very different from the works that he published throughout his life, because this was published posthumously. I hope I said that right. But basically, he died in 1933. And if you fast forward about 50 years, so going on late 1970s, going into the early 1980s, his family, members of the Roberts family, reached out to the University of Utah. And they had in their possession a number of manuscripts that had been passed down from the moment he died. And these manuscripts were his studies of the Book of Mormon, as well as a number of letters of correspondence between himself and other leaders of the church regarding these studies. Now, it was the intention of his family that the University of Utah would not only preserve the studies, but that they would also get them into publication, which is exactly what they did. Now, the book begins with a sort of introduction written by two different professors from the University of Utah, Brigham D. Matson and Sterling McCurran. Now, McCurran's introduction to B.H. Roberts is basically getting the point across that Roberts' faith in the Book of Mormon was completely unshakable. He actually praises Roberts and his ability to act, as he calls it, in the capacity of the chief defender of the faith, which kind of reiterates what I was saying about Roberts in his influence in this period of Mormonism. McCurran talks up Roberts so much that he actually claims that there is nobody who has been able to defend the Book of Mormon in the same capacity and with the same effectiveness as Roberts has been able to do throughout the course of his life. And so the main point of McCurran's introduction is that despite the fact that Roberts is presenting questions and criticisms of the Book of Mormon, we should not, as readers, assume that Roberts was having any amount of doubt. And this is kind of repeated a little bit as well in the introduction by Matson. Matson goes in a little bit more in depth into some of the criticisms of the Book of Mormon that Roberts had addressed in the past, as well as some of the books that Roberts published throughout the course of his life. Matson then goes on to give us a sort of introduction to the documents that Roberts' family had in their possession, and then some of the history and correspondence that we have presented to us in the letters that were part of these manuscript collection. Now, the letters that the family included in this stack of manuscripts kind of told us the story of almost like a game of telephone, where a bunch of different individuals were writing letters to each other in correspondence that basically resulted in Roberts carrying out these Book of Mormon studies. So here's the story. A man by the name of Mr. Couch had 5 concerns or questions regarding the Book of Mormon and its authenticity. He took these 5 questions and he asked them to a man by the name of William Ryder that he had been discussing the church with. Now, Ryder didn't have the answer to any of these 5 questions. So in hopes of getting a response, he wrote a letter to James E. Talmage. Talmage received this letter, realized he did not have the answers either to any of these 5 questions, so he wrote them down in a letter and sent them to B.H. Roberts. Now, Roberts sat on these questions for long enough that William Ryder sent a follow-up letter to Roberts. And in this letter, he basically said, hey, Elder Talmage said that he passed these questions along to you. I was just curious if you had any kind of a response to this. Roberts responded and said that these questions were proving him more difficult than he thought to answer. And so he actually had been sitting on these for a number of weeks. He tried thinking them through himself based on the things that he had studied, and he had realized that he actually didn't have very much information to answer the 5 questions presented by Mr. Couch. And so he decided he needed to go out. He needed to see what literature already existed to see if the church had any kind of explanations to the 5 questions. And ultimately, it resulted in a 141-page study that was later presented to the First Presidency, the Quorum of the 12, and the Quorum of the 70. Now, here are the 5 questions that Roberts attempted to answer in his 141-page study titled Book of Mormon Difficulties, a Study. The first, how could the great diversity in primitive Indian languages have occurred in such a short period after about 400 AD, when the Nephites, whose Hebrew language was so highly developed, disappeared? Number 2, the Book of Mormon reports that the followers of Lehi, upon their arrival in the New World, found horses which were not in existence when the first Spanish explorers arrived. Number 3, although the Jews had no knowledge of steel in 600 BC, Nephi was reported to have had a bow of steel after he left Jerusalem. Number 4, the Book of Mormon speaks of swords and scimitars, and yet the word scimitar does not appear in early literature before the rise of Mohammedanism, which took place after Lehi departed from Jerusalem. Number 5. Even though silk was not known in America, the Nephites knew of and used silk. Now, the ultimate conclusion that Roberts came to in his 141-page response and study to these 5 concerns was that the church did not have an adequate response to answer any of these 5 questions. Now, he was bothered so much by this that he not only took the 141 pages and mailed it to Mr. Ryder, he actually took his entire 141-page report and he mailed it out to the First Presidency, the entire Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and the entire Quorum of the 70. And in his letter to all of these different quorums, he said, "I trust I am not manifesting an over-anxiety in presenting to you so extensive an inquiry as this paper proposes, 141 typewritten pages, but I assure you that I am most thoroughly convinced of the necessity of all the brethren herein addressed becoming familiar with these Book of Mormon problems and finding the answer for them, as it is a matter that will concern the faith of the youth of the church now as also in the future, as well as such casual inquirers as may come to us from the outside world." Now, this 141-page report actually resulted in a multi-day meeting from all of the 3 different quorums that he had mailed this letter to. The quorum, the First Presidency, the Quorum of the 12, and the Quorum of the 70. And over the course of it was 2 or 3 days, he presented every single finding and every single criticism that he had encountered while answering Mr. Couch's questions. However, he was incredibly disappointed at the response he got from the leadership of the church. In some of the correspondence that we see, he communicates that near the end of the meetings, a lot of the men were dozing off, and so he felt that he kind of had to skip over some information, despite the fact that he really felt strongly that they needed to have a firm understanding of this. A lot of the men in the meetings started going off on tangents. They weren't talking about the issues he was presenting. They started bringing up stuff from other books that he had written. He had to keep, bringing them back in and saying, no, I covered that in that book. This is a completely different thing. Like, we really need to focus on these 5 questions. He actually was so disappointed in the response he got from the leadership of the church and their lack of urgency or seriousness on the matter, that he shortly afterwards wrote a letter to the president of the church, Heber J. Grant. And this is what he said. He said, "I just wanted the brethren to know that I was quite disappointed in the results of our conference, but notwithstanding, I shall be most earnestly alert upon the subject of Book of Mormon difficulties, hoping for the development of new knowledge and for new light to fall upon what which has already been learned, to the vindication of what God has revealed in the Book of Mormon. But I cannot be other than painfully conscious of the fact that our means of defense, should we be vigorously attacked along the lines of Mr. Couch's questions, are very inadequate." Now, what do you suppose the brethren of the church wanted the response of the church to be in regard to these questions? Honestly, it's about what you would expect. What they wanted to do was to simply do nothing. They felt strongly that the Book of Mormon could stand by itself and that the criticisms that Roberts had presented were just negative in nature and were just intended to attack the church. As a matter of fact, James E. Talmage at one point stood up and said that if the Book of Mormon said that Lehi and his family saw horses when they arrived on the American continent, then that means that there were horses on the American continent. The approach was that we were just going to take the Book of Mormon as it was presented to us, and that if we continued to pursue these types of questions, it was just going to cause more problems. As a matter of fact, Roberts brings this up in another letter to Heber J. Grant. He brought up that throughout the course of this study, he had more questions come up that he felt he needed to go further in depth on. And so he brought this up in the meeting, and he actually had a leader of the church ask him, will pursuing these further questions raise more questions? And Robert said, yes, it would. And the man told him, then why are we going to bother pursuing that? So the approach that the leadership of the church wanted to do was basically to just stop asking questions, because asking questions was just going to bring up more questions, and they just didn't want that. But Roberts was not happy with that approach. And he actually went out and he did more research, and he did a second study that's presented in this book. So in the second study that we have presented in this book, which is simply called A Book of Mormon Study, Roberts attempts to try and find answers to those additional questions that had kind of showed themselves while he was writing the original 141-page study. So he steps away from Mr. Couch's questions and he starts to explore other avenues. Now, his main focus of this study is to try and see what potential source material would have been available to Joseph Smith at the time, and that could have possibly inspired the text of the Book of Mormon itself, if we were to assume that it was not an ancient record and that it was not what the Book of Mormon claimed that it could be. Now, he does talk pretty significantly about the fact that Joseph Smith was absolutely exposed to enough public discourse regarding Native Americans being of Hebrew descent that it was completely within the realm of possibility that those ideas made their way into the Book of Mormon without Joseph Smith ever once having to read any of the literature that expressed those ideas. He actually even touches on the fact that Joseph Smith was well known, by his family at least, of being a gifted storyteller, and that he's able to demonstrate throughout his life this remarkable ability to absorb knowledge and information simply from possibly the conversations around him. And so his conclusion regarding Joseph Smith's imaginative mind is that it is completely within the realm of possibility that Joseph Smith could have written the Book of Mormon, and that he simply could have just made it all up. Now, he doesn't accept that idea, but he does acknowledge that it is completely possible. He also talks a lot about a lot of the conversion stories that were happening at the time, a lot of the preaching that was happening, and how a lot of those themes and ideas made their way in to the Book of Mormon. Now, it kind of wraps it up. He talks a lot about Ethan Smith's A View of the Hebrews. And this is kind of considered a third study included in this studies of the Book of Mormon, kind of a finale to the book. But really, it's just a summary of an additional study that wasn't ever published. What Roberts did is, one of the leading theories is that the Book of Mormon is largely based off of Ethan Smith's A View of the Hebrews. So Roberts kind of explored that idea. He wrote out an entire study comparing the two texts together. Supposedly, he claims that there's a quite large, extensive study that he had put together. But due to the fact that these two previous studies were taking up so much space and he wanted people to look into the information more, he was only providing a summarized version of a much larger study. So, to completely summarize, we have three different studies presented in this book. We have Book of Mormon Problems, a study which explores Mr. Couch's 5 original questions. Then we have a Book of Mormon study, which explores possible influences of the Book of Mormon. And then we have a very short summary of a much larger study that was never published, comparing A View of the Hebrews to the Book of Mormon. Okay, so I'm sure at this point some of you are wondering, Mason, you're not a Mormon anymore. You don't believe in the Book of Mormon. Why in the world are you promoting a book written by a Mormon apologist, sold in Mormon bookstores, sitting on the shelves of Mormon households? Like, why would this be the book to promote? And I think The main reason I'm drawn to this book so much is the fact that Roberts was willing to ask the hard questions. He was a known defender of the faith. He had a very strong presence as somebody who had all of the answers, but he was willing to go before the entire leadership of the church and say, gentlemen, we don't have the answers to these questions, and this is bothering me. We need to ask more questions. Only to get the response, why would you ask more questions? The Book of Mormon stands on its own. We shouldn't ask these questions. It's just going to raise more difficulties. Despite that, he was willing to go out and continue to ask questions. And that's absolutely commendable. And that's an example that the average member of the church needs to see, that it is okay to ask the questions and it's okay to question your faith, because questioning your faith doesn't mean that you're sinning or that you're doing something wrong. That's part of the learning process. I would rather see somebody question their faith, try and seek out all of the answers they can from both perspectives. Try and get the apologist answers and the critical answers, and then come to your own conclusion. If you can look at both sides of an issue and 100% tell yourself that you still believe the Book of Mormon is true, then by all means do that. But don't have doubts and then just push them to the side, because no growth comes from that and you're just following blindly. So ask the hard questions. If you stay in the church, more power to you. If you leave, more power to you. At least, no matter what decision you make, you're better informed.